start. We'll see if anybody else wanders in. Does that sound like it's reasonable? Okay. So, just a very quick review. 2 weeks ago, we talked about, in terms of Steinberg, whether it's reasonable, not provable, but reasonable to believe in God. What's the argument for that? And it boiled down to a kind of argument from design, which goes all the way back to Aristotle. I don't know if I mentioned that before, but Aristotle, early on in Greek time, lists various proofs of God, and one of them is the argument from design. Then we moved on to something entirely different, which was Abraham Joshua Heschel, because we're now talking about an existential approach to the questions of God and Jewish philosophy and Jewish theology, namely, how do we experience things, and which of those experiences matter in terms of leading us towards God? And remember, for Abraham Joshua Heschel, his term d'art for that was radical amazement, right? That's the experience that needs to be cultivated that leads us to God. Then we went to perhaps the most difficult to read and maybe most difficult to understand, Martin Buber, from his famous, he wrote all sorts of things, but the only thing that he wrote that ever gets quoted is I, Thou, which is described by Louis Jacobs here as a philosophical poem, which is a very adroit way of describing it, in which he also is an existentialist. He is in the realm of experience. That's what he's working from, Martin Buber. But for him, the experience that matters is not radical amazement, but relationship. And specifically, not the I-it relationship, which is the descriptive relationship of the other, but the subjective relationship, I-thou, that's what he called it, subject to subject. And the eternal thou, if you will, makes that possible. The eternal thou, I think, is another phrase for God. And so God is involved in every I-thou relationship. So relationship is what mattered for Martin Buber. We're going to stay in the realm of experience, because that's what matters in Jewish philosophy. Oh, well, I skipped something. We also talked about Mordechai Kaplan, and I tried to explain why he was so important in his time, leading to the Reconstructionist movement, and his whole approach of trying to show that Judaism and science were compatible and not incompatible. And indeed, you could understand Judaism, you could understand theology, God, in a scientific way. God is the power that makes for salvation, and salvation is defined as the goal of ultimate self-actualization, whether we're talking about individuals or communities, peoples, nations. It's important, but we've sort of moved off of that rationale kind of thing, thinking in terms of reason, into the realm of experience. So we're picking it up with Richard Rubenstein, who I believe is perhaps the easiest to understand, but in many ways the most challenging. Particularly as I look around the room here, and I'm making a snap judgment about our average age. Now, the reason I am saying that, some of us dye our hair, some of us don't dye our hair, but in general, I don't want to cast any aspersions here, but in general, we are of a generation that is highly connected to and concerned with the Shoah, with the Holocaust. And that's what consumed Richard Rubenstein. His entire academic career is about the Holocaust. So he believed, and this I know because it actually was a conversation I had with him, and I heard him say these into my own ears. So I know this is what he thought. It's not like we were buddies and he had conversations with me at all times. It was once or twice this happened at given conferences where I ended up at the same table with him. And so I had an opportunity to hear certain things that he had to say, both pro and con, positive and negative. But what he felt is rather than pursuing an academic discipline, he wanted to pursue an academic problem, a human issue, and then pursue it wherever it took him. So because his issue was the Holocaust, and because of that, he starts out with theology. That's perhaps his most famous book, which is called After Auschwitz. But then he moves into history and sociology and psychology and all sorts of other things. The book of his that he wrote that I like the best is a little bitty book. It's only about 90 pages with the footnotes, and it's called The Cunning of History, where he tries to explain essentially how it is that a guy like Hitler got to be chancellor and wasn't removed. How is it that he wasn't locked up? What was the nature of society? What was the nature of humanity? And he goes all the way back into history, but he sees most of the antecedents in World War I. It's not a big surprise there. But he lays it all out in a very clear way, and he explains how it's possible that this most civilized nation on earth, at least that's what everybody thought at the time, could kill all the people that they killed while most of the rest of the world just watched. Unless you think that that's too harsh, it isn't. It's pretty clear the United States knew what was going on and did nothing about it. It's absolutely clear that Great Britain knew what was going on and did nothing about it. And why is that? Because they wouldn't have done these things themselves, but they really weren't all that motivated to stop somebody else from doing it. Okay, so those are the kinds of questions that he asks. If you're curious about that, look into The Cunning of History, that little book. Cunning, if I'm not pronouncing it clearly. Okay, but this is the theology. We're talking about theology tonight, so it's not from After Auschwitz, but it's from Commentary Magazine, which was a different magazine in 1966 than it later became. This is before it became identified to sort of the right of center to more right-wing magazine that it became. Early on, Commentary Magazine, certainly in the 60s, was a sort of many viewpoints kind of magazine. And this is from a piece that he wrote in 1966. Now, why is 1966 important? We're talking roughly 20 years after the details of the Holocaust began to spill out, right? And it's important. I'm 16 in 1966. I knew nothing about the Holocaust. No one taught it in religious school. I guarantee that was true here, everywhere. No one really taught about the Holocaust. We didn't know what to say, and if there was something to say, it sort of felt shameful, and the Jewish community was essentially silent, really until the 70s on this subject. But it wasn't just the Jewish community. How do I know that? In the Christian world, there was something called the Death of God School of Theology that grew out of Christian thinking. Okay. Richard Rubenstein is the Jewish equivalent of that, all writing at the same time. Okay? Is that enough background? Are we relatively clear on who he was? Okay. So, he's about the death of God. So he starts with, no man can really say that God is dead. How could we know that? Nevertheless, I am compelled to say that we live in the time of the death of God. Now, what does he mean? This is more a statement about man. Remember, none of these people are contemporaries in terms of their choice of gendered language or not, right? The more is a statement about man and his culture than about God. The death of God is a cultural fact. I can understand, Buber uses the term eclipse of God. I can understand his reluctance to use the more explicitly Christian terminology. Those are those other thinkers. I am compelled to utilize it because of my conviction that the time when Nietzsche's madman said was too far off has come upon us. There is no way around Nietzsche. Had I lived in another time or another culture, I might have found some other vocabulary to express my meanings. I am, however, a religious existentialist, after Nietzsche and after Auschwitz. When I say we live in the time of the death of God, I mean that the thread uniting God and man, heaven and earth, has been broken. We stand in a cold, silent, unfeeling cosmos, unaided by any purposeful power beyond our own resources. After Auschwitz, what else can a Jew say about God? In other words, and he'll be explicit in the next paragraph, why is that thread broken? Why is the connection, the bridge, whatever metaphor you want to use, why is it broken? Because God, according to Rubenstein, does nothing during the Shoah. By the way, Shoah is an infinitely better word than Holocaust. I am driven to use the word Holocaust because that's the term that's used in English. Holocaust means a holy burnt offering. It is a kind of sacrifice that was given in the temple, the Olah sacrifice. So when you say Holocaust, you are implying that the dead were an offering to God, which frankly I find obscene. Unfortunately, Elie Wiesel chose this word, if I remember correctly. And if Elie Wiesel chose the word, who can argue with Elie Wiesel? Me. I think it was a bad choice. The Hebrew is much better. Shoah simply means unmitigated disaster. Absolute disaster. And that's a far more descriptive term that is not loaded with theological terminology, theological connotations that we really can't accept. Okay, look at the next paragraph and you'll see what he means specifically. I believe the greatest single challenge to modern Judaism arises out of the question of God in the death camps. I am amazed at the silence of contemporary theologians. Now remember, this is 20 years after, and I'm offering personal testimony that people didn't talk about this. And I was old enough at 16 in high school to know, this would have been something I would have picked up if this was a topic. It wasn't a topic, really, at least not in my experience. How can Jews believe in an omnipotent, beneficent God after Auschwitz? Traditional Jewish theology maintains that God is the ultimate, omnipotent actor in the historical drama. It has interpreted every major catastrophe in Jewish history as God's punishment of the sinful Israel. I fail to see how this position can be maintained without regarding Hitler and the SS as instruments of God's will. Does that track for everybody? Can you see that? That if God is punishing either Israel or humanity, you choose how far you want to draw the circle, with the Nazis, then you have to see them as God's instruments. The agony of European Jewry cannot be likened to the testing of Job. To see any purpose in the death camps, the traditional believer is forced to regard the most demonic, anti-human explosion in all history as a meaningful expression of God's purposes. The idea is simply too obscene for me to accept. Me too. I do not think that the full impact of Auschwitz has yet been felt in Jewish theology or Jewish life. Great religious revolutions have their own period of gestation. No man knows the hour when the full impact of Auschwitz will be felt, but no religious community can endure so hideous a wounding without undergoing vast inner disorders. Comments about that? Yes, sir. Did everybody hear that? What makes this different than the Inquisition, the Crusades, the pogroms in Eastern Europe? And his answer is nothing. There is no difference. It's just that the Shoah is so gargantuan and so present like hovering over everything, that it can't be ignored. Because it's the worst. In his view, it's the worst. And so therefore, he would have said, all of that was just rationalization, was just bad theology. Does that make sense? That's why I said he is very challenging. He's not hard to understand. His language is quite clear. Nothing like Buber, at least in English. I don't know, maybe if you read Rubenstein in German, he sounds like Buber in English. I don't know. But certainly, he's very direct and very challenging. Joel. We're going to get there. It's coming. He said, it doesn't really say that God is dead yet. So what did he really think? It's coming in the next paragraph. But you're right. He said that right from the very beginning, the first sentence. God is dead is a convenient way of saying there is no godly influence in the world. Right? That the bridge has been cut. The string has been cut. We're on our own. This is sort of like what the non-religious existentialists were saying that I kept talking about, Sartre, Camus, all those people who were saying the world is absurd. What did they mean when they said the world is absurd? It's meaningless. There is no connection to an ultimate meaningful actor, creator, whatever term you want to use. And so therefore, it's just us and the choices we make. So he's more or less in their camp, but he wants to be religious. Richard Rubenstein's background is in addition to his regular education, he went to Hebrew College down the road. Didn't like it there. Ended up at JTS in New York. Finished JTS. He had rabbinic ordination from Jewish Theological Seminary, but then went on and got a PhD and spent his whole career as an academic. Except for that short period of time where he probably needed, I don't know this, but he probably needed to earn money, and so he worked in a Hillel on campus. This is what a lot of academics do. They need some sort of job as they're going through graduate school, and they use the rabbinic credentials in a quasi-academic way on campus. That's what I mean by that. And I think he fell into that too. The word Shoah is just Hebrew. I probably could look it up. It may appear in the Bible. Do you know? If it appears in the Bible, it's probably in the book of Job or someplace there. Reading the Hebrew in the book of Job, there's a phrase in Hebrew that you break your teeth on the Hebrew, and my teeth are broken. So it's like I don't do it usually. I'm struggling enough to actually be fairly fluent in modern Hebrew, and to go read that kind of stuff, it's like reading Beowulf. It means an unmitigated disaster. That's what it means. I don't know what. I can't tell you because I don't know where it is, and if it is or where it is in the Bible. Did I see a hand over here, Amy? So, but it does seem that there's this sort of continuing, these disasters don't just happen to Jews, they happen to other people in other places and to the rest of the world. So Amy is asking, if you didn't hear clearly, that, okay, this is from a Jewish point of view, but isn't the same problem exist on a human perspective? I don't know this for a fact, but I'm almost certain he would have agreed with that. But he's Jewish. He's writing out of a Jewish perspective, and he's writing in the years where the Shoah is the only issue. Still to this day, if you're an academic, a Jewish academic who is interested in being hired to do lectures around the country, what subject is the best subject for you to become an expert in if you want to get hired? The answer is Holocaust studies. Going away. Yes, Karen, did you find it? In Daniel? Nathaniel? Zephaniah? Okay. In one of the prophets. It shows up in one of the prophets. I don't know if there's a context for what is the reference to the word or not. But so it is in the Bible. Okay. It's easy today. You can go online and with a biblical thesaurus put in show and see if it shows up anywhere. We used to have to go to the bookshelf and take down a book and look at, I have 3 of those books in my hidden room in my house because nobody uses books anymore. Okay, here's the answer to your question, Joel. Though I believe, I'm on page 42, though I believe that a void stands where once we experience God's presence, that's what he means by death of God, I do not think Judaism has lost its meaning. I do not believe that a theistic God is necessary for Jewish religious life. In other words, sort of saying something like Kaplan. We don't have to believe in a personal God, but he wants to go beyond Kaplan. But just to give himself some bona fides, Dietrich Bonhoeffer has written that our problem is how to speak of God in an age of no religion. I believe that our problem is how to speak of religion in an age of no God. I have suggested that Judaism is the way in which we share our decisive times and crises of life through the traditions of our inherited community. I've heard him say this. In other words, he thinks that Judaism is a culture, sort of Kaplanian, and so we continue to be Jews and we continue to be Jewish. We continue to be Jews as a people. We continue to be Jewish as an expression of that culture because that's who we are. So we have our way of welcoming children into the world. We have our way of burying people when they die. We have our way of observing the calendar, right? He just doesn't think you need God for any of that. It's all just part of our culture. And so we continue it. The need for that sharing is not diminished in the time of the death of God. We no longer believe in the God who has the power to annul the tragic necessities of existence. The need religiously to share that existence remains. Okay? So for him, he wants to continue Judaism. One of my arguments with him on this is maybe his argument made sense to his own generation, putting him a few years older than me. He died last year, 2 years ago, in his 80s. But each succeeding generation, if the only thing that's holding it together is a nostalgia culture, it won't hold. That magnetism is not strong enough, in my opinion. The atoms will just come apart. And he never really addresses that. But he does say this: finally, the time of the death of God does not mean the end of all gods. Now, if you know something about Jewish mysticism, what he's about to say will sort of ring a little bit for you. It means the demise of the God who is the ultimate actor in history. I believe in God. The holy nothingness. Now, that's a bad way to read it. I wish he had printed it differently, or the magazine commentary. It should be the holy no-thingness. Right? There's a thing, and then there is a no thing. God is a no thing. So the holy no thingness, that's God in his opinion. It's known to the mystics of all ages, out of which we come and to which we shall ultimately return. If you want an example of this, one of the metaphors that is used is wind over an ocean or a body of water that is causing whitecaps. Each one of those whitecaps has its own individuality as long as it exists. But it came out of the mass of water and returns to the mass of water. This is a kind of mystical notion of what God is. That we grow out of God like one of those whitecaps. We have kind of a quasi-independent existence for however long it is, but then we return to the great body of the water. And that's what he's talking about. So he says, I concur with atheistic existentialists such as Sartre and Camus In much of their analysis of the broken condition of human finitude, we must endure that condition without illusion or hope. I do not part company with them on their analysis of the human predicament. I part company on the issue of the necessity of religion as the way in which we share that predicament. Their analysis of human hopelessness leads me to look to the religious community as the institution in which that condition can be shared in depth. Now, there's something there in what he is saying. I think many contemporary Jews continue to belong to the Jewish community because of the sharing of that community. They may not believe in the theology. They may not be all that observant of the history and the customs and the culture, but there is a kind of a shared identity, and that seems to be important. And I think that's what he's alluding to. The limitations of finitude can be overcome only when we return to the nothingness out of which we have been thrust. In the final analysis, omnipotent nothingness is Lord of all creation. So what do we think? How can he be a rabbi? You mean because he doesn't believe in a classical experience of God? In the 1960s, I may have mentioned this before, I think I've got this right. Somebody would actually have to check. I'm thinking of the stream now. Somebody would actually have to check to see if I got this right. In the 1960s, there was a study called the Lens Study that studied pulpit rabbis, congregational rabbis, and the like, and what they actually believed. And there was some ridiculously high number of them that did not believe in God. I'm forgetting, 40%, 50%, some really large number. And there's a difference between leadership within a culture, within a community, and necessarily what a given individual believes. Would you like an example of that? I can give you a personal example of that. Probably shouldn't, but I will. Karen finds all this funny. She's hoping that I'm going to say everything that she's always wanted to say, but all right. Anyway, when it began to become popular to sing the Mishaberach prayer, theologically I had a lot of difficulty with that. And I had difficulty with it because I have difficulty with almost all petitionary prayer. I'll make it absurd for you if you'd like. You know, when the football coach gathers the team around and they pray before a football game for victory, I barely can keep myself from laughing out loud. Why? You think God cares which team wins? And God really always wants Notre Dame to win? I mean, really, and God is answering no to the other team? I mean, and we do this all the time. I mean, I know I'm picking an absurd example. And I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago about that last sermon that I gave at Omega Baptist Church about real prayer is praise and thanksgiving, not petitionary prayer. So I had a lot of trouble with the Mishaberach prayer. And that caused me to ask myself, do I impose my feelings onto the congregation? I would go so far, I think it's a reasonable statement to say, for many people who come to services, it is not just important, it is the most important thing that happens in the service. More important than the Torah reading. Certainly more important than the sermon. More important than almost anything. And how do I know? By the way people behave. In terms of wanting the names to be on there, calling the names, all the rest of it. And so this is a case where when you are in leadership position, you do what's good for the community as opposed to whatever your personal theology might be. There's a difference. Okay? And I think that that's something that every pulpit rabbi learns if they want to survive in the pulpit, that you have to make those distinctions. Yeah. We call that conservadox. Sure. Mm-hmm. But for him, the bridge had snapped. The thread was broken. And it's perfectly understandable. It's perfectly understandable, which is why I think that we need to read Richard Rubenstein. I'm not going to agree with him. You're going to see in a minute why I'm not going to agree with him. But we need to read, because he puts the challenge right in front of us. And I agree with Amy. The challenge could come regarding evil in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to come in terms of the Holocaust. But for Jews, certainly of our generation, Jews of our generation, and I think still younger, it can't be avoided. If you're going to look at the Holocaust, that is the way you're likely going to confront the issues of theology and evil, theology and the Holocaust. I think you're going to do a whole course on this, so I'm sure Karen will have all sorts of other things to say about it. Of prayer for praise? You mean, what is the point of praise? It's about us. I'm sorry, I didn't understand. No, I think praising God is good for us. Thanking God is good for us. And that's why we do it. Does it matter to God? Do I think whether it matters to God? I'm pretty sure it doesn't. That's, in my view, it's selfish. It's like saying, God, pay so much attention to me that you take care of what I need. Personally, you ask my personal opinion, I think it's selfish. Yeah. With the Shoah, right? That is exactly. That's exactly, which is why he was saying, I can go with the mystics. You know, the notion of God as the source of being, to me, that's the point about praise and thanks. That it's essentially you're praising the source of being. You're thanking the source of being for existence. It's not the same thing as asking to win the football game. And I know that on purpose I'm drawing this straw thing. I get that. And I also understand the psychological kinds of things that happen in moments of crisis. I told you I went through this 6 months ago when I found Simone completely unresponsive. I can't even tell you what I remember went through my head and what words and the like. But I know that psychologically what's generated out of that. But sort of sitting back, looking at something sort of a little more coolly, a little more dispassionately, that's where I have come down. That's my personal thing. Did I see a hand over here? Yeah.
Prayer or praise is like Hessel's idea of all, we're praising this wonderful universe, which Hessel says leads to God.
Right. Exactly. So I'm essentially agreeing with Heschel. And by the way, I'm agreeing with Buber too, because I think relationship does it also. At least it has in my experience. That's what I tried to show last week. Okay, let's look at the response. The response is sort of straightforward. Emil Fackenheim. Have we heard of him? Well, Fran has heard of him. No, but so Emil Fackenheim is a professional philosopher. He taught philosophy at the University of Toronto. I first encountered him as an undergraduate when I had to write a paper on Hegel. You know, when you're an undergraduate philosophy major, you have to write all sorts of odd things. And he had a book in the library called The Religious Dimension in Hegel. I think that was the title. And I checked it out, and so I was sort of vaguely familiar with him. I didn't really know whether he was Jewish or not, and I certainly didn't know that he had anything to say Jewishly. This would have been around 1970, and you see the piece here was written in 1967. People in this world certainly knew who he was Jewishly, but I didn't. And I think I was sort of the norm. Anyhow, Emil Fackenheim, a professional philosopher, on the side also wrote about Jewish things. And coming out of Germany, I think it's obvious that the issue for him was also the Shoah, was also the Holocaust. And I read him as a direct response to Richard Rubenstein. Richard Rubenstein says, how can we possibly believe in an omnipotent, good, omniscient God after Auschwitz unless we want to believe that there is some divine plan in which Hitler is God's agent? And the killing of millions of Jews and millions more of lots of other people, I think the number that's usually used is 18 million total in the time of the Second World War. Certainly 11 million who were literally slaughtered by the Nazis. Then how can we possibly say that this is God's agent and not think that that's obscene? That's Richard Rubenstein, right? Direct challenge. So Fackenheim wants to answer. He wants to answer. And he's coming out of existential, out of his own experience, Let's see if you find his answer persuasive. Now, it's a little subtle. In the present situation, this question becomes, can we confront the Holocaust and yet not despair? Rubenstein, you have despaired. That's what he's saying. Not accidentally, it has taken 20 years for us to face this question. 1967, same time that Rubenstein was just writing. And it is not certain that we can face it yet. The contradiction is too staggering, and every authentic escape is barred. What is he saying to Rubenstein? Very well argued, Richard. Every authentic escape, meaning intellectual escape, is barred. We are forbidden to turn present and future life into death as the price of remembering death at Auschwitz. And we are forbidden to affirm present and future life as the price of forgetting Auschwitz. What happens if all we do is talk about Auschwitz? We're dead. And what happens if we stop talking about Auschwitz? We forget. Do you follow? He's being very straightforward here. He's not playing any games. He knows that Richard Rubenstein has produced a serious challenge. Okay, here comes the big paragraph. All of you are so smart that you're anticipating the next paragraph before I read it. Seriously. He knows that you're going to have that question. We have lived in this contradiction for 20 years without being able to face it. Unless I am mistaken, we are now beginning to face it, however fragmentarily and inconclusively. And from this beginning confrontation emerges, and he knows he's about to say something really bold, what I will boldly term the 614th commandment. How many mitzvot are there? 613. Emil Fackenheim believes there's a 614th. 613 aren't sufficient. There's a 614th. And what is the 614th? Now I'm going to ask you, do you hear this commandment? The authentic Jew of today is forbidden to hand Hitler yet another posthumous victory. He is experiencing this. He is hearing, reverberating in his head, not a thought, a mitzvah, a commandment, reverberating in his head that says, thou shalt not give Hitler another posthumous victory. His whole thought, the whole thing here, depends on whether you hear it also. If you don't hear it, nothing he's going to say makes any sense. It will have no power at all. If you do hear it, not as a suggestion, not as a thought, not as an aphorism, but as a commandment, right? What's an aphorism in this case? Never again, right? How many times? I mean, it was used to be a big, big deal in the Federation world, right? That was what was in every campaign, never again. How do I know it was an aphorism? Did it motivate anybody? Not really. It might have motivated some giving. I'll give it that. However, there has been incident, case after case, you know, whether we're talking about Rwanda, whether we're talking about the Cambodians, or it's not like never again really was a mitzvah. He is saying, thou shalt not give Hitler another posthumous victory is a mitzvah. Not mitzvah in the sense of good deed. I know I'm harping on this, but the whole thing is right here in this paragraph. This formulation is terribly inadequate, yet I am forced to use it until one more adequate is found. I can tell you one more adequate was never found. First, although no anti-Orthodox implication is intended, as though 613 stood necessarily in need of change, we must face the fact that something radically new has happened. Second, although the commandment should be positive rather than negative, we must face the fact that Hitler did win at least one victory, the murder of 6 million Jews. I would go further than this. I would say Hitler's major war, what he really cared about, was the destruction of the Jews. And winning the Second World War was secondary. How do I know that? When he could have diverted trains and filled them up with ammunition and sent them to the fronts, he kept taking Jews to Auschwitz. And I think he won that war in the sense that certainly Eastern European Jewry, Central European Jewry was destroyed. 3 million Jews in Poland before the war. 30,000 at the end of the war. 1/10 of 1%. 99.9% eradication. Okay, so he says he won at least one victory, the murder of 6 million Jews. Third, although the very name of Hitler should be erased rather than remembered, we cannot disguise the uniqueness of his evil under a comfortable generality such as persecution in general, tyranny in general, or even the demonic in general. Now, this is where it's relevant to Amy's earlier question, because Fackenheim is one of these people that thinks the Shoah is sui generis. Not that there isn't all these other kinds of evil, but the Shoah is its own category. And so, therefore, it presents its own mitzvah. Okay? I think the authentic Jew of today is beginning to hear the 614th commandment, and he hears it whether as an agnostic he hears no more, or whether as believer he hears the voice of the mitzvah, which means the commander, God, in the mitzvah, the commandment. Moreover, it may well be the case that the authentic Jewish agnostic and the authentic Jewish believer are closer today than at any previous time. In other words, he thinks we can be hearing this as a mitzvah even if we're not so sure. We can hear this as a commandment even if we're not so sure there's a commander. Where do you mean? You mean in 110? It's 100. Is it 1%? Okay. I should have said 33,000. I'm making up the number anyway. No, but I can't do any real math, but I'm usually pretty good at arithmetic. That's what most people call arithmetic math. It's not the same. Ask me to do a differential equation, I can't even tell you what it is. Anyway. Okay, but do we follow what he is saying here? Thank you, though, for correcting me here. 99% is pretty good. All right, so what is... He is saying that if we hear the commandment, it's going to make all the difference. All right, here's the implications. This is where the rubber meets the road. Let's see what you make of this. The implications of even so slender a bond are momentous, if you hear the commandment. If the 614th commandment is binding upon the authentic Jew, and by the way, I hate the use of his word authentic. You know what authentic means? Nothing. It means anything whoever is speaking it wants it to mean. It's a positive way of saying, I agree with this, you should agree with it too. You're not an authentic Jew unless you agree with me. Right? Because this is, obviously, if you were authentic, you would understand this. And by the way, it's not just him here. The word authentic has been drained of its meaning. People use it simply as a motivator. Anyway, he is saying the authentic Jew, then we are first commanded to survive as Jews, lest the Jewish people perish. Why are we commanded to survive? Because if we do not survive, we would be giving Hitler a posthumous victory, because what did Hitler want? To destroy the Jewish people. Some of you know, there's one of them here. There's these Torahs that were all found in Prague, that were distributed throughout the Jewish world. Why were they there in Prague? Because Hitler was going to create a museum to an extinct race. That's why all of the silver and all the other stuff there, if you go to Prague, you can still see the best of it. A lot of the rest has been distributed or is in warehouses, but it's all on display. And these Torahs, it was more than 1,000 Torahs, if I remember right, have been... He was going to create a museum to an extinct race. So if we don't survive, who wins? So if we hear a commandment that says you won't give Hitler a posthumous victory, you also are hearing a commandment that you must survive. The Jewish community must survive. Okay. Second, to remember in our very guts and bones the martyrs of the Holocaust, lest their memory perish. Same point. Right? Hitler wins if we are destroyed, if our memory is destroyed. Because what makes Jews Jews is our memory. We are forbidden, thirdly, here's the tricky one, to deny or despair of God, however much we may have to contend with him or with belief in him, lest Judaism perish. Now, if you see this as a conversation with Richard Rubenstein, what is he saying, like I do? What is he saying to Richard Rubenstein? Your notion of what Judaism isn't going to survive. And Judaism is going to die. Hitler will have another victory. So therefore, if Judaism is going to survive, it cannot survive without a relationship with God. The traditional God, in some sense. And so therefore, even though we can't explain it, we don't understand it, it's full of contradictions, it drives us insane, we have to continue to maintain our belief in God. Otherwise, we are giving Hitler a posthumous victory. Are you convinced? I am. With all of the problems, he's not sliding away from anything. He's acknowledging to Rubenstein, you've got an airtight argument, except I have an experience of a 614th commandment, which is a commandment, and I must observe it. And in order to observe it, because it's a commandment, then I cannot despair of God. I agree. What Aaron said is he's talking right after the Holocaust. We're now 70 years after the Holocaust. It's still relevant to us. But when it's 700 years after the Holocaust, is this going to be relevant? I don't know the answer. But what I know is that's why he talked about memory. So when I would be teaching 15-year-olds this in confirmation class, most of them at least would acknowledge that they heard the commandment. In other words, they know enough about this. They know Hitler is like the root of all evil, the mother of all evil. And so therefore, not giving Hitler a posthumous victory resonated. Now, whether they understand anything at 15 is a real commandment. That's an open question. Right? But they could get this even this far away. Because for them, 70 years, 700 years, it's all the same. When you're talking to a 15-year-old. At least that's been my experience. Once it's history, it's history. Long ago, they're all dead. It doesn't matter anymore. So I believe if this becomes part and parcel of Jewish memory, then it doesn't die. And just as an aside, this is not a course on this, but part of the reason why, in my view, a universal Yom HaShoah liturgy has to be developed. A liturgy for Holocaust Memorial Day that the Jewish community adopts in the same way that the Jewish community adopt the Passover Seder as a way of remembering the Exodus from Egypt. Why have we not forgotten the Exodus from Egypt? Because we observe it. We have it woven into our fabric. What we need is a Megillat Shoah, a scroll of the Holocaust, which is not written as history, but written as a kind of sacred history, a sacred story, just like the Haggadah is written as a kind of sacred retelling of the Exodus, which, by the way, doesn't even agree with what's in the book of Exodus. But it's written in a certain way. The problem is you can't get Jews to agree on anything, even the movements. There have been these Megillot written. But I'm worried about it because how do we observe Holocaust Memorial Day? Somebody talks. Those people... That's at the end. I think we're at the end of that. I don't know who's the last few years here who's been the speakers, but the speakers now were people who were 6 and 7 during the Holocaust and were part of the Kinder transport or one. So there aren't going to be any of these people anymore to talk. And I don't believe that lighting 6 candles is going to be sufficient. Unless we develop something like Megillat Esther, which is how we keep the story of Purim alive. Even though, in my opinion, there's no historicity to the story of Purim at all. But we keep it alive as part of our history because we have a ritual for it. And it certainly worked in terms of Passover. I believe it even works in terms of Hanukkah. Just less so. We've sort of crunched up the story a lot. But if you look in the prayer book, you'll get a version of the story of Hanukkah in the insert to the prayer in the tefillah. We do that because memory is what matters. So it's not an accident that that's number 2, that we have to find a way to remember. So we have to survive. We have to find a way to remember. We cannot despair of God. And here, this is just for Amy. Look at number 4. We are finally forbidden to despair of the world as the place which is to become the kingdom of God, lest we help make it a meaningless place in which God is dead or irrelevant and everything is permitted. Now, this is a really clever bit of reasoning. If you agree with Richard Rubenstein and God is dead, God is irrelevant, how do we say that Hitler was wrong? If there's no ultimate standard of right and wrong, of good and evil, which tradition tells us is the teachings that we get from God, then how are we to say we are right, he was wrong? We can say we were stronger than him and we prevailed. But how can we say he was wrong? How can we say he was the source of all evil if you eliminate the ground of the universe, the ground of the moral universe? If you eliminate God, how can we say Hitler was a demon? It was just his choice, just like we make our choices. That's the whole existential evaluation, right? Everybody makes their choices. See what he's doing there? He's saying you can't despair of the world. Because if you despair of the world, then you turn the world into something meaningless. And if you turn the world into something meaningless, that there is no ultimate right or wrong, then everything is permitted. And if everything is permitted, Hitler was permitted. Do you follow the reasoning? It's giving Hitler the ultimate posthumous victory. So he wants to argue, he wants to argue that there are 4 mitzvot embedded in the mitzvah. That if you hear, thou shalt not give Hitler another posthumous victory, then the Jewish community must survive. The Jewish people must survive. We must remember what happened in the Holocaust. We have to not despair of God, and we cannot despair of the world. In other words, all of Judaism has been rebuilt out of the 614th mitzvah. Yes?
So then God is a useful fiction?
Is a useful fiction? No, he doesn't think it's a fiction. Really, that's why I said he's hearing a commandment. For him, the commandment comes from a commander. Now, he's acknowledging that there's a lot of people out there that hear the mitzvah but don't agree that there's a commander. But for him, there's a commander. And that's why he's hearing the mitzvah. God is in his head. So where Heschel is led to God through the experience of radical amazement, and Buber is led to God through the experience of relationship, the I-thou relationship, Fackenheim is led to God through the experience of hearing the 614th commandment. He just lays it all the way out. Does this just like overwhelm everybody?
He's coming back to a personal God.
You notice he never specifically said that in this piece. Now, he wrote a lot of stuff. But what he is saying, he never really says a theistic God, but what he is saying is there's a commander.
That implies one giving a command implies there's a personal relation.
Can the universe command? I think that Kaplan would have said, sure. It's the force that brings us towards self-actualization. That's a kind of pull, a kind of commandment. It depends on how literal or how metaphorical you're willing to take the language. Who else? You're all staring at the papers like it's going to tell you something that I didn't say. Yes. I'm not sure if you want to say this. Amy was trying to update this into the present. To the people who seem to be contemporary versions of at least how the Nazis got started. Right? The people who say Jews will not replace us, and the people who are concerned about I don't want to become too political. You know, that's easy for me. That's sort of my hobby horse, my favorite thing to do. But I'm trying to avoid that here. I would argue that the world has pretty much, along what Aaron was saying, forgotten what the Shoah is all about. And at least to the point that we had reached a point where certain things couldn't be said out loud because they were posnish. They were forbidden. You just can't say those kind of things. And now even they can be said again. We're even moving beyond dog whistles to just overt language. And I think that's the beginning. It's the beginning. Some of us are pretty frightened about the way things seem to be going. And this is the source of my concern. that steps that should have been taken to have, which is in the Cunning of History, steps that might have been taken early on that would have changed everything, and he wants to explain why they weren't. I'll give you an example where Rubenstein says, he says, look, in the First World War, there were battles between the two sides where more than 100,000 soldiers died on each side to do nothing. Nothing. Maybe to move the front a foot or two in each direction. Literally, the Brits were okay with 100,000 of their boys dying. The French, the Germans, they were all okay with that. He said, is it any surprise that you go a little deeper into the century and nobody cares if somebody starts killing millions of people? He said all the antecedents were laid in behaviors and things that happened early in the century. And actually, he sees several things that go back centuries before that. But do you follow my point? If you don't see where something is leading and you don't do something early on, it gets harder and harder to change it as it grows and it develops. And at least speaking for me, I think that's what a lot of people are afraid of today, is that we have forgotten the issues of the Holocaust. But we're now talking sociology and politics, as opposed to the theology, which is what Rubenstein was talking about in this little piece. He's specifically dealing with the challenge of theistic theology in the age of Auschwitz. And Fackenheim is responding to the challenge about theistic theology after Auschwitz. So that's what I build this as. So that's why I keep trying to stay on that. Anybody else? Joel and then Aaron. According to Fackenheim? According to me, what does Judaism have to offer us? It offers us identity, and it offers us culture, and it offers us history and languages. That's why I'm enamored of Kaplan. In other words, I like pieces of everybody we've looked at so far. Meaning, I would have to go beyond simple theology to answer the question that you asked. A Chabadnik, and it would be much better to let Nachum Engel speak for himself, but a Chabadnik is likely to say everything that Judaism has to offer grows out of his relationship with God. That's hard for me to say. For me, everything Judaism has to offer grows out of our history and our culture and our civilization, which includes the religious elements and the relationship with God. Because I think I have had I-thou relationships. In other words, I think I have experienced God in the I-thou relationship. I think I have experienced God in the experience of radical amazement. I think I hear, maybe not as profoundly as Fackenheim did, but I think I hear the 614th commandment, which leads me, motivates me, not to make sure the Jewish people survives and to make sure that Judaism survives and that our relationship with God survives. I don't know if I'm answering your question. But so what? Is that what you're asking? Okay, so I'm going to answer you in a weird sort of way. Do you watch Star Trek? Yes? Okay, so in Next Generation, there is a scene where Worf is on a planet where there are some Klingon children who have been separated from their culture and their families since they were really little. And he starts to tell them stories, and they behave like you, the children, and they start to ask questions like, who cares? Why is this relevant? Does he convince them? Does he give them a logical argument? Does he produce a syllogism or some sort of reasoning? What he says to them, stop. These are our stories. You need to know them. That's the way I feel about Jewish identity. These are our stories. We need to know them. If you're going to ask me why can't I just be a citizen of the world? I have no answer for that. But most people, overwhelmingly, people do not want to be a citizen of the world. They want to belong to something. And if you want to belong to the Jewish people, then we have a history and a culture and languages and food and all the rest of this and stories. You think it was an accident over 12 years I must have told 12,000 stories? Because I think that the stories have the best chance of actually sticking. That's what people remember. Knowing the stories is what matters in terms of identity. And so for me, it's all about that, but I can't answer you directly with a convincing argument.
Bringing it back to Reform Judaism, two questions. You talk about the liturgy, but you don't want to show it. Is Reform doing anything about it?
Lots of Reform rabbis have tried to do something about it. Well, how do you... So I have a friend who actually wrote a Megillat Shoah. The conservative movement has a Megillat Shoah. I think maybe it's even quasi-official in the conservative movement. But you know how difficult it is to try to make this stick, for lack of a better word, especially when Yom HaShoah, and I'm not saying this critically, I'm just saying it descriptively, especially when Yom HaShoah has become a communal event. Right? So it's not, can we find some wording of a Megillat Shoah that the Reform movement could accept? Imagine trying to find that wording that everybody's going to accept for a communal service. That's why you have a survivor speak. It could. It could. It could be done. All sorts of things could happen if you're talking about in the realm of what could be. But what this doesn't have is the weight of history. Do you think somebody sits around and said, we need a story with a heroine instead of a hero? And we need this story about a time when a powerful country was going to destroy all the Jews, but through their own machinations, they claimed that God helped them because they turned to God for inspiration. But actually, it was all their own doing. They saved themselves. And not only that, they then killed everybody else who were their enemies. You know what that is? It's the book of Esther. If somebody tried to write that today, you think it would catch on? You gotta have, if you don't have the weight of history behind you, read it. Which is a fantastic point. Did everybody hear Rita? Okay, so Rita said the problem with Fackenheim's 614th commandment, I'm going to paraphrase you, is that only the commandment itself is quoted, not the other four implications of it. And so as a result of that, it's as if we're telling our kids to be Jewish out of spite. Right? Your phrase was to spit in Hitler's eye. I think that that's spite. I actually knew somebody who was a Reform rabbi, who was a rabbi to spite Hitler. Literally, he said this. He was the rabbi of Rosh Shalom congregation in New York, and in a meeting I was sitting, he said that I managed to survive, and we got out, and I was going to spit in Hitler's eye and show him not only didn't he kill all the Jews, but this one was going to be a rabbi. And he became a rabbi. But I agree with you, because when you only quote the commandment and you don't take the time to either explain that this commandment is not just an aphorism, but it's something that we have to hear, and it has to reverberate, and it has to motivate us. And then if it motivates us, these are the implications of it. You notice it stops being about Hitler in a sense. It starts being about redeeming the world, and it starts being about continuing Judaism, and it starts being about the Jewish people surviving. Not just about Hitler. But your criticism, I believe, is an accurate description of what has happened actually in the Jewish community. And here's where you fold into Aaron's point. If that's all you've got to say to kids, they forget this really fast. If all you've got to say to kids is the negative message, and it can be in terms of the 614th commandment, or it can be, you might as well be Jewish because the rest of the world's not going to let you be anything else anyway. Right? Or it could be like something my father used to say, it's embarrassing to say this, that if you scratch a non-Jew deep enough, you always find an anti-Semite. Those are when it's negative, that works, I suppose, for people who have experienced anti-Semitism in significant ways, particularly survivors of the Shoah. But it doesn't work in the long run. Judaism has to be positive. And we worked, at least my time here, and I believe this is continuing, Karen, you can correct me, worked really, really hard to project that positive image, to teach the kids along those lines, to try to provide positive experiences, positive reasons why people want to be Jewish, as opposed to, for lack of a better term, the negative reasons, which Rita so wonderfully summed up. And I'm sorry I didn't say it and that you needed to remind me, because you're absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Anybody else? We have like 5 minutes or 3 minutes. Yeah, but we've been ending between 1/4 till and 10 minutes till. That's true. See, some people though, as soon as I get home, she will have food ready for me, be just like Ozzy and Harriet. And any of you who know my wife know that she's just like Harriet and Ozzy and Harriet. And I am exactly like Ozzy, who never worked a day in his life. Did you ever see him work on that show? Yeah. Well, okay, so it seems as if I made a mistake here tonight in bringing up liturgy in my own thinking, because now everybody wants to ask me about these things. But I'll try to answer you. One way to look at liturgy is to look at it literally. And if you look at it literally, in my opinion, speaking just for me, there's virtually nothing that can be said. To me, the best liturgy, if we're going to look at it literally, is silence or melodies. Nigunim, just melodies, where people can fill it up with whatever they want, because I'm going to have a problem with the language if I'm taking it literally on almost anything. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed are you, eternal our God, creator of the world. Do we mean that literally? Do we really mean that literally? Do we believe in what's going to be read Friday night, Genesis 1? No? Do we really think that? There's almost nothing that we can say. Nope, there is nothing we can say. I will go so far. So for me, the only way to pray verbally with words is to have a very high degree, high sense of metaphor. And understand that everything is a metaphor and is a way of trying to express feelings, but is not to be taken literally. And the same thing applies with B'Tselem Elohim, which is one of the great phrases from the book of Genesis. It's in day 6 in Parshat Bereshit, which is this week, that we are created B'Tselem of God. What is the Tselem of God? Is it like God has a soul, we have a soul? Does it literally mean image of God, that we look like God? Does anybody think that here? Does anybody think we actually look like God? So clearly we are in the realm of metaphor. And this is this is why real prayer doesn't happen with children. Children can pray, but they need to learn the prayers so that when they're older, they can look at the prayers and understand that they have to pour themselves into it, which is another way of deciding what the metaphors are and what's meaningful to them, as opposed to understanding it in a rote way. That's what we learned from Steinberg, that when you have that kindergarten mentality about what's God or what's prayer or what's religion, likely it's going to be rejected. Each one of these thinkers, I think, gives us something serious. Even if we don't take the whole enchilada from any of them, each one of them, I think, gives us something serious. Did I see another hand someplace? Yes.
You talk about the show and, the anxiety, whether it's going to be forgotten or how it's taken. And you talk about the book of Esther. Many of these things, like all history, it changes in time. It's been rewritten. I think that it takes time to accept.
Well, but the thing is, see, the book of Esther doesn't get rewritten. Our understanding of the book of Esther gets rewritten. So granted, the rabbis rewrote the Exodus story. They're the final redactors of the Exodus story in something called the Haggadah. Okay? But the Haggadah continues to grow and continues to be reinterpreted and continues. One of the great things about the Haggadah is you can focus in on a different thing every Pesach. The Seder never has to be exactly the same. But you still pull out the same Haggadah every year, right? I'm still using my grandmother's Haggadahs, which are terribly old-fashioned. I use them because they were hers. It was the old conservative movement ones. There's no gender-neutral language. Everything in it sort of grates on the ear when you're talking about gender. But it's so funny where she has in the books all of my deceased relatives' names and their parts. So my Uncle Bob, who was generally considered in the family the root of all evil, she always gave him the wicked child. And whoever gets it, we call Bob for that night. So I use these things over and over and over again because there's more to it even than just the text, but we use the text. But if we want to have something that holds us together, I think having the text and the liturgy that we can all reflect on differently, but that we all share in common, is very, very important. So the Reformed prayer book is very different from a traditional Orthodox prayer book if you look at the surface. But actually the outline of the service is identical, even in the new Shmagegi prayer books. It's exactly the same service. right? And so that's all part of the common culture. It's all part of the common culture. And so what we're going to look at next week is this writ large, because we're going to briefly look at Theodor Herzl and what because he was giving an answer to anti-Semitism. And then we're going to look at a guy named Asher Ginsburg, who's otherwise known as Echad Ha'am, that was his pen name, one of the people, and his response to Herzl. And I think between the two of them, you get the foundation of what the meaning of the State of Israel is. Obviously, the State of Israel is the Jewish community on the biggest stage, in biggest kind of numbers, and it's very, very complex. But I want to give you a way, just like tonight I was hoping to give you a way to think about the Holocaust theologically that maybe you had never had before. So I want to give you an opportunity, a way to think about the State of Israel, maybe in ways that you've thought about, but maybe not exactly the way I put it, or you haven't thought about it all. Right? And it happens that on Sunday, for better or for worse, they asked me to do this opening non-brunch Brotherhood brunch. There's no food, apparently, but there's the Brotherhood brunch. And what I'm going to try to do is to talk a little bit about what's going on in Israel right now, which is so confusing. There's a couple of articles that I will hopefully hand out to everybody, that because I won't be able to talk about everything in them, but it'll give you a fairly good idea as to what's really happening in the Jewish people there, so that you can understand this craziness of 4 elections in 3 years, and in 3 years or in 2 years, I don't remember now, and what's really going on there with some intellectual framework to understand it. So that's what I'm going to try to do on Sunday and then next Tuesday. But I thank you for your patience and for showing up again for three weeks in a row. Thanks.